Well, just to interject there, when we look at, say, modern China now and the immense changes and the incredible things that they're doing, I presume that property rights and copyright laws and all this kind of stuff is now becoming more and more important in China, because now they've become massively industrialized, and they're the lead, top nation nearly now. Will this, I mean, is there a legal revolution going on in China? And how, again, rather like the stuff that we talked about in terms of technology and what was needed there, will there eventually or soon be a kind of clash between the needs of a centralized state to keep control and a legal system that's going to perhaps give rights where they didn't exist before?
Well, another good question. And it's interested me since I first went to China, because Sarah, my wife, is a magistrate and practiced the law for a long time. And this was another amazing feature, the amateur magistracy, which protects people, also another feature. But as a magistrate, and our joint interest in legal history and law meant that throughout our stays in China, we've made an effort to find out something about the Chinese legal reforms. And I've talked to a number of lawyers, and Sarah and I have visited courts in China. And there has been a legal revolution. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. We spent a day in a Chinese court some years ago now, sort of 6 or 7 years ago. And it was very impressive. I mean, it was what you might expect in an English magistrate's court, laws of evidence, people being heard, care taken. And it was really, the feeling was not very different from anything here. And before that, some years before that, in Shanghai and elsewhere, I talked to Chinese lawyers, and they were explaining the new attempts. They were setting up new kinds of courts. They were, as you say, trying to bring in copyright law. They were trying to protect people in all sorts of ways. They'd reform the family law. In some ways, the Chinese now are ahead of us in their aspects of their family law. For example, recently they brought in a provision which we don't have, which means that wives are paid in a separation or divorce settlement. Wives are paid for their domestic services. They've contributed domestic services to the house. Now that's something we haven't yet got. So there are ways, as in their educational system, where they are developing things which we haven't got. And they have made laws to do with wills and inheritance and the power of the family and so on, which we don't have. Now, it is an incredible legal revolution, just as their industrial revolution has done in one generation what we took 100 years to do. They've done in one generation something that it took Europe hundreds of years to do. But it does come up against this crunch, because in a central feature of the rule of law, as it's considered in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, is that you have a separation between law and politics, that law is independent of politics. It's part of this separations of modernity. Law, if you think of law and why it's important, it's basically the independent umpire, the referee between conflicting forces. So if you have modernity with its separation between politics, economics, and so on, you need something that adjudicates the conflicts between these. And in most systems, you don't have that, because you don't have the separation and you don't have the independent law. So law and politics in France traditionally, or whatever. But in England, we have this fiction of the separation. But it's a difficult fiction to preserve. I mean, anyone who studied the last 4 years of America could see how the American system was veering headlong towards the subjugation of the law under the political system, because the Supreme Court was being packed to the right. Judges were being dismissed and political judges put in. There were being pressures put on the courts and on the investigation agencies and so on. And if that had gone on for another 4 years or 8 years, America would no longer be the model it presents itself as. And in India, there is the same tendency of the bringing together. So it's very difficult to maintain the separation. And even in England recently, this has been undermined. The Lord Chancellor now is much more of a political appointment than he used to be. And the courts, their constant cries from the media and so on, you know, these judges should be shown the way out, etc., etc. But basically, in China, you have this problem on a huge scale, because, as I've said before, the problem with China is you have 1.3 billion people, and you have to have a very firm political system to hold it together. Because if you don't hold it together, you have absolute disaster, as has happened again and again. And there are tendencies for the edges constantly to split off, and which is what the Americans are constantly trying to do, as Huntington and others have said. What we want to do is to try and cause trouble on the margins of China, and then the system will implode. Now, it's not just in the margins. You have a well-educated, tech-savvy population. And so the political system has to keep a real firm check on, otherwise it'll just fly into pieces, it'll disintegrate, the center cannot hold, anarchy is loosed upon and so on. So if you have an independent judiciary which would protect the individual against the state, and the state wants to, say, build a highway as part of its mega plan, and the local judges say, no, you can't have this land, or the farmers come and say, you know, the local political bosses are causing us trouble, and they're corrupt and so on, and the judiciary side with them. You have this real tension. That, combined with the fact that you still have in China basically a Confucian society where people are in some ways not equal, that the rights of the group dominate the rights of the individual. So you can't have absolute individual rights against. And we saw this with the COVID reaction, that the success of the Chinese with that was largely because the group was more important than the individual, and people sacrificed themselves for the group. So it can have a good effect, but it could mean that the individual is not as protected. Now, how this will work out, I don't know. It's the same tension between, in the economic system, between a system of state organization of the economy and individual capitalism, which you're finding in China. How it'll work out, I don't know, but there is a tension, and one should recognize it and see how it can be solved.